When we think of the Great War, we picture soldiers in muddy trenches, poison gas drifting across no man's land, and the thunder of artillery that never ceased. But behind every soldier who survived the horrors of the Western Front stood an invisible army, millions of civilians whose ingenuity, sacrifice, and fieldcraft kept the war machine alive. These weren't just factory workers or nurses in clean hospitals. They were the women who turned drawing rooms into ammunition workshops, the miners who risked cave-ins to extract the coal that powered every locomotive and warship, the farmers who coaxed harvests from depleted soil while their sons died in Flanders. This is their story, a story of survival, innovation, and the forgotten skills that fed, clothed, and sustained entire nations on the brink of collapse. Step into a munitions factory in 1916, where the acrid smell of TNT hangs so thick you can taste the metal on your tongue, and the rhythmic pounding of hydraulic presses creates a percussion that vibrates through your chest. Here, women known as canary girls, their skin turned yellow from toxic exposure, worked 12-hour shifts, filling artillery shells with explosives precise enough to detonate on impact thousands of miles away. These weren't simple assembly line tasks. Women learned metalworking, calibration, and chemical handling that rivaled any tradecraft. They understood that a shell packed too loosely would be a dud, too tightly a premature detonation that could kill the gun crew. They developed an intuitive feel for the work, reading the consistency of explosive compounds by touch and sight, making micro-adjustments that textbooks couldn't teach. Nurse Edith Cavell's story exemplifies the brutal intersection of healing and survival that defined civilian medical work during the Great War. In occupied Belgium, she ran a training hospital that doubled as an escape network for Allied soldiers, teaching young nurses not just anatomy and wound care, but also counter-surveillance, document forgery, and the kind of operational security that intelligence agencies would formalize decades later. These nurses learned to identify infection by smell before visible symptoms appeared, the sweet, nauseating odor of gangrene, the particular mustiness of trench foot, making diagnoses in conditions where laboratory tests were impossible. Field hospitals operated on principles that survivalists would recognize immediately: triage based on available resources rather than ideal treatment, maximum efficiency of every supply, and adaptation to whatever tools were at hand. Nurses sterilized instruments over alcohol lamps when autoclaves failed, improvised drainage tubes from rubber tubing, scavenged from damaged vehicles, and created antiseptic solutions from carbolic acid, diluted to precise concentrations they calculated mentally because scales were luxuries. They understood wound-packing techniques using sphagnum moss, which they gathered and sterilized themselves because its natural antiseptic properties and absorbency outperformed cotton when supplies ran short. This wasn't textbook medicine, this was battlefield improvisation raised to an art form that saved thousands of lives despite impossible conditions. When German forces swept through Belgium in August 1914, they created a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented scale. Over 1 million refugees fled westward with whatever they could carry. Civilian aid workers faced a survival scenario that would challenge any modern prepper: housing, feeding, and organizing masses of traumatized people with no warning, no infrastructure, and, honestly, no end date in sight. They requisitioned buildings, transforming schools and warehouses into dormitories with sleeping arrangements that maximized warmth and minimized disease transmission. They established communal kitchens that operated on principles any expedition cook would recognize: bulk preparation of calorie-dense foods using the most efficient cooking methods, rotating menus based on whatever supplies arrived that day, and waste management systems that prevented contamination in crowded conditions. These civilian organizers developed resource allocation systems that balanced immediate needs against uncertain futures, creating reserve supplies while distributing enough to prevent unrest. A judgment call that could mean the difference between order and chaos. They taught refugees survival skills for their temporary circumstances, how to purify questionable water using cloth filtration and boiling, how to construct privacy screens from scavenged materials, how to maintain hygiene without running water or proper sanitation. The resilience of these communities came from shared knowledge and mutual aid, skills passed person to person that enabled survival when official systems collapsed. The civilian heroes of the First World War didn't just support soldiers. They pioneered survival techniques that remain relevant in every crisis, from natural disasters to economic collapse. Their ability to adapt, improvise, and preserve knowledge under existential pressure created frameworks we still use today. Urban gardening movements trace their lineage to those wartime allotments. Community emergency response teams echo the organizational structures civilians developed for air raid protection and fire brigades. Even modern food preservation techniques, pressure canning, dehydration, fermentation, were refined and distributed on massive scales during those desperate years. What these unsung heroes teach us transcends any specific skill or technique. They remind us that survival isn't just about individual preparation, but about community resilience, shared knowledge, and the willingness to adapt when everything familiar collapses. In an age where supply chains seem fragile and self-reliance feels increasingly necessary, their example offers both inspiration and instruction. They faced scarcity we can barely imagine, and not only survived but maintained their humanity, their ingenuity, and their determination to build something better from the ashes. If this journey through history's most challenging survival scenario resonated with you, subscribe to Fieldcraft Chronicles. Share this video with anyone who values preparedness, appreciates history, and understands that the most important survival skill is the ability to learn from those who faced the ultimate test and prevailed. Their fieldcraft is our inheritance. Let's make sure it's never forgotten.